man built an empire using a book he found in the ruins of a dead civilization, and that empire crucified its enemies, erased the names of the people it conquered, and came within hours of seizing the most powerful structure in the post-war American Southwest. The book was incomplete. He never found the missing pages. He built everything anyway. Welcome to this quiet journey through the world of Caesar's Legion. One of the most brutal, most calculated, and most misunderstood factions ever to rise from the dust of the wasteland. Let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from tonight, and if these calm explorations of Fallout lore help you unwind and drift off. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Across the Mojave Desert, east of the Colorado River, a force unlike anything the post-war world had yet produced was assembled. Not from the survivors of old governments or the remnants of military units, but from conquered tribes, stolen knowledge, and one man's unshakable certainty that history had already written the answer to civilization's collapse. What followed was not random, it was designed. Caesar's Legion was built on a foundation that almost no one in the wasteland would have recognized or understood. Its creator, a man who had once gone by the name Edward Sallow, was not a warlord by birth or a soldier by training. He had been a citizen of the New California Republic, the largest democratic federation to emerge from the ruins of the old world. And before that, a scholar of sorts, employed by the followers of the apocalypse to translate the languages of tribal peoples east of the Colorado. He was sent there not for his strength, but for his mind. It was in a crumbling library, somewhere in the irradiated stretch of land that had once been Arizona, that Sallow found an incomplete copy of De Bello Gallico, the war journal written by Julius Caesar nearly 2,000 years before the bombs fell. The pages were water damaged, sections were missing. What remained was enough. The document was used not as a historical record, but as a blueprint for conquest. And the civilization that rose from its pages was engineered with a clarity that shocked every faction it encountered. In the wasteland, most things are built by accident. Caesar's Legion was built on purpose. That same document quietly shaped one of the Legion's most deliberate and far-reaching policies, one that governed who was permitted to read and who was not. In Caesar's Legion, literacy was not a right. It was a tool of control, and like all tools of control, it was kept in the hands of those whose authority depended on others remaining dependent. The rank-and-file soldier, the recruit legionary, the standard legionary marching under the bull standard, was never taught to read or write. That knowledge was sealed away within the leadership caste, the frumentari, who served as Caesar's intelligence network, and the centurions, who commanded units in the field. The result was a force in which ordinary soldiers could not read orders, could not forge documents, could not record their own doubts. Their entire understanding of the world flowed through their commanders, and their commanders' understanding flowed through Caesar. Each layer of the hierarchy existed to interpret and filter the one above it. Illiteracy was not a failure of the system. It was the system. It was designed precisely this way, and it held. The command structure those commanders occupied was not invented by Sallow, either. It was inherited, borrowed whole from the military hierarchy of ancient Rome. Recruit legionary, legionary, prime legionary, decanus, vexillarius, centurion, legate. These ranks were not approximations or loose adaptations. They were lifted almost verbatim from the organizational structure of the Roman legions that had existed centuries before. Even the pre-war nation of the United States had drawn its first border. Every title carried its original meaning. A decanus commanded 8 to 10 soldiers, the same number a Roman decanus had commanded in the 1st century. A centurion led 80 to 100 men, again consistent with historical precedent. The structure was not merely borrowed for its aesthetic value. It was borrowed because it had been proven across hundreds of years of actual warfare. And Caesar understood that a system which had survived that long had survived for a reason. In the wasteland, where most institutions collapse within a generation, the legion's hierarchy endured. What those centurions wore into battle was perhaps less majestic than their Roman predecessors might have hoped. Centurion armor was assembled from whatever the wasteland provided. Pre-war football padding was stripped from the ruins of old stadiums and warehouses. Sports helmets, cracked, faded, still carrying traces of team colors beneath coats of dried paint, were repurposed as head protection. Leather straps, salvaged metal plates, and bits of chain were laced together to hold it all in place. The result was armor that looked cobbled and rough by any military standard. Yet it was precisely that roughness which carried meaning. A centurion's armor was not meant to look polished. It was meant to look survived. Every mismatched piece was a record of something endured, something taken, something repurposed from a dead world and made to serve the living one. The brutality of the aesthetic was the message. These officers had not been given their equipment. They had taken it. That distinction was never lost on the soldiers who followed them. The leather that held a centurion's armor together was not entirely different, in one quiet and terrible way, from the metal that held a slave's collar in place. Legion slave collars were hand-welded from scrap, irregular, heavy, and marked with a small engraved number pressed into the metal near the locking mechanism. That number corresponded to an entry in a ledger kept by the slave master of each contubernium, the Legion's smallest tactical unit. The ledger recorded the slave's tribal origin, their assigned labor function, and the date of their capture. If a slave managed to escape, the entry was not removed. The number was crossed out, a single horizontal line drawn through it, and the record remained. The crossing out was never accidental. The Legion did not erase its losses. It documented them, kept them preserved in rows of ink on salvaged paper, because the record itself served a purpose. It reminded those who maintained it that the world owed the Legion nothing, and that every gap in the ledger was a debt still outstanding. Those ledgers were kept, but the currency used to settle accounts between factions was something else entirely. Caesar's Legion operated with its own coinage, silver and gold coins, each one stamped with Caesar's face on one side and the Legion's bull emblem on the other. The coins were hand-pressed at Fortification Hill, the Legion's seat of power along the Colorado River. They were not minted in large quantities. They were produced carefully, treated as symbols of the Legion's permanence, as much as instruments of trade. The New California Republic refused to honor them, as the NCR refused to honor almost anything the Legion produced. The Legion, in return, treated NCR dollars as the paper products of a doomed republic, worthless in the long run. When soldiers or traders from both factions needed to exchange goods, bottle caps served as the neutral ground between two systems that refused to acknowledge each other. In the ruins of old America, a bottle cap had become more stable than either silver or paper. That fact alone said something about the wasteland. What those coins could not purchase was sold through no market at all. The Legion maintained no merchant class. Not a single dedicated trader, shopkeeper, or civilian vendor operating under Legion authority. All goods moved through military channels. Captured supplies were redistributed by rank. Tribute payments extracted from conquered tribes were folded into Legion stores. The output of slave labor, food production, equipment repair, construction, fed the camps without any exchange of currency between the people who produced it and the soldiers who consumed it. There were no shops, no stalls, no negotiated prices, no markets of any kind. The economy of the Legion was a closed loop, sealed against the disorder that Caesar associated with commerce, and the silence of it, the absence of any busy, chaotic human market noise, was itself a signal. Control over goods was control over survival, and in the wasteland, survival was the only argument that mattered. What Caesar built was not merely an army. It was a world deliberately stripped of the things that had failed before it. And in that stripping, something both terrible and precise had taken shape across the desert. Patient, structured, and waiting at the banks of the Colorado for whatever came next. The man who built one of the most feared armies in the post-war world was, at the moment of his capture, completely unarmed, academically trained, and entirely at the mercy of a tribe that could have killed him before morning. He did not escape. He did not negotiate. He looked at his captors, calculated what they needed, and decided to become indispensable. Within months, he was giving orders. Within years, he was a god. The story of Caesar begins not in a tent beside the Colorado River, but inside a vault. Specifically Vault 29, sealed beneath the earth, somewhere in the territory that had once been Colorado. Vault 29 was designed with a narrow and deliberate admission policy. Only children under the age of 15 were accepted at the time of the bombs. Adults were turned away. The vault's population was raised under the guidance of Zax, a supercomputer system that shaped their education around nature, tribal philosophy, and communal survival, rather than the pre-war technological values that had defined the world above. Edward Sallow was born inside those sealed walls in 2226, into a community that had been deliberately cut off from the kind of civilization his future self would spend decades trying to rebuild. The isolation of Vault 29 left its residents with a particular kind of mind, one shaped by systems and structure, by the logic of the Zax unit, by the sense that the world outside was something to be approached carefully, with knowledge prepared in advance. Sallow carried that shaped mind with him when he eventually left. What he did after leaving was not what the Vault's philosophy would have predicted. Sallow joined the Followers of the Apocalypse, a humanitarian organization dedicated to preserving knowledge and providing medical and educational support to wasteland communities. His assigned role was translation. The Followers had identified tribal dialects east of the Colorado River as an area requiring documentation, and Sallow was sent there not because of any combat skill or physical quality, but because he had demonstrated academic aptitude. His ability to learn languages quickly, to pattern match across dialects, to sit with unfamiliar people and find the grammar beneath their words. That was what made him useful. He was dispatched toward Arizona as a scholar, carrying notebooks and reference texts, accompanied by a companion named Joshua Graham, who served as a guide and field protector. The pair were traveling through tribal territory in what had once been Arizona when the Blackfoot tribe found them. The Blackfoot did not greet them, they took them. Sallow and Graham were captured and held by a tribe that was losing a slow war against several neighboring groups simultaneously. What followed was not a rescue. No one came for them. Instead, Sallow made a calculation that would define everything that came after. He offered to teach the Blackfoot tribe how to maintain, disassemble, and operate firearms properly. Weapons the tribe possessed in rough form, but could not use with any real effectiveness. The Blackfoot accepted. They were taught. Their fighting capacity increased. Sallow used that increased capacity to direct the tribe against its rivals, absorbing defeated groups into an expanding force that answered increasingly to him. By the time the surrounding tribes had been subdued or consumed, Sallow had positioned himself at the center of a military structure that he had built from the inside of a cage. He named it the Legion. He named himself Caesar. Joshua Graham was not left behind in that transformation. He was carried forward into it, remade by it. Graham became Caesar's Malpais legate, the primary military commander of the Legion's early campaigns across Arizona and Utah and New Mexico. His reputation grew into something that made entire tribes surrender before a single battle was fought. He was Caesar's most effective instrument for well over a decade, and the bond between them was understood by everyone in the Legion to be foundational. It was, perhaps, the closest thing Caesar ever permitted himself to genuine trust. What was done to Graham afterward, then, was not merely a punishment. It was a demonstration of what trust cost inside the Legion's order. After the First Battle of Hoover Dam, a Legion assault on the great pre-war dam along the Colorado River that ended in failure, Caesar held Graham responsible. The Malpais legate had commanded the attack. The attack had not succeeded. In Caesar's framework, the commander bore all consequences. Graham was sentenced not to a clean execution, but to something slower and more visible. He was wrapped in pitch, set on fire, and thrown into the Grand Canyon. The sentence was carried out. The Legion was told nothing further. What Caesar may or may not have known, and never confirmed to anyone, was that Graham did not die. He survived the fall. He survived the burning. He made his way north into the territory of Zion, the national park that had become a refuge for scattered tribal communities. And he rebuilt himself there into something the Legion would not have recognized. Caesar never sent anyone to confirm the outcome. The Legion was never told the man had lived. The silence around Graham's survival was as deliberate as any order Caesar ever gave, and it sealed a gap in the Legion's history that was never officially acknowledged. What pressed at Caesar more immediately than old failures was something quieter and more personal, a growth within his own skull. By the time the Legion's forces massed along the Colorado in preparation for a second campaign against Hoover Dam, Caesar was suffering from a brain tumor, slow-growing but measurable, producing headaches and episodes of pain that his personal physician, a man named Arcade Gannon, was asked to manage in private. The urgency behind the Legion's renewed push toward the dam was not entirely strategic. It was biological. Caesar understood that time was not neutral. A campaign that might have been fought at a measured pace was instead pushed forward with a pressure that his officers felt, but were never given a reason to understand. The dam had to fall while Caesar was still alive to see it fall. The machine had to reach its destination before the man who built it could no longer hold the controls. Whether Caesar lived or died at that moment was, in the end, a matter that others held in their hands. His tumor could be addressed through surgery, a procedure risky enough that its outcome was genuinely uncertain. If the operation succeeded, Caesar recovered, and the Legion's campaign continued under his direction. If it failed, or was made to fail by someone with the opportunity and the will to arrange that outcome, Caesar died quietly on the table, surrounded by his own power, without spectacle. In either case, the Legion did not stop. The structure held. Orders continued to move through the hierarchy. The bull standard remained over the camps. The machine Caesar had built was not designed to require him. It was designed to outlast him. That design was not accidental and not modest. Caesar had shaped his public identity, the white robes, the laurel, the title itself, the rituals performed in his presence, with a specific and documented intention. He told members of his inner circle, in direct terms preserved in personal records, from Fortification Hill, that the role of Caesar was meant to be transferable. The man who held it would age and die. The symbol would not. He expected to be worshipped, not despite his mortality, but because of his understanding of it. Because a leader who had already converted himself into a god concept was not diminished by the loss of his body. Gods, as Caesar observed to those closest to him, do not require breath to remain in force. Edward Sallow had studied enough history to understand that the most dangerous leaders were the ones who made themselves into symbols, and symbols, unlike men, could not be put down with a single clean shot. The Legion did not carry food. It did not maintain warehouses along its supply routes, or send protected convoys of provisions behind its marching columns. It arrived somewhere, and it fed itself from whatever that place had produced before it got there. That single fact made it nearly impossible to defeat through patience alone, and it had kept NCR generals awake at night, for years before the first soldier ever reached the banks of the Colorado. Most organized forces in the wasteland depend on supply lines. Cut those lines and the army starves. NCR commanders understood this principle well and had used it effectively against raider groups and smaller tribal forces throughout their campaigns east of California. Against the Legion, the strategy failed entirely. Caesar's forces were designed to live off captured stores and tribute payments extracted from the territories they had already subdued. Conquered tribes did not simply surrender their fighters. They surrendered their harvests, their preserved food, their water sources, and their labor. That output flowed into the Legion's camps in steady, distributed amounts from dozens of separate sources, spread across a wide territory. There was no single line to cut, no central depot to destroy, no point of logistical vulnerability that an opposing force could target cleanly. Legion columns moved light and resupplied through conquest itself, so that each new advance funded the next. NCR generals reported this reality in field documents preserved in the ruins of Camp McCarran, and those documents described, with increasing frustration, a force that seemed to draw strength from the act of moving forward. That forward movement, when it crossed the Colorado River, required a different kind of preparation. The Colorado was not a shallow obstacle. Its current was strong, and its width varied between banks that offered little natural cover. The Legion crossed it using hand-built wooden rafts, constructed in advance by engineers of the Legion. The technical specialists who occupied one of the few roles permitted access to written materials. Those engineers were allowed to read and retain pre-war technical manuals related to construction and watercraft. What they learned from those documents was not written down again. It was memorized and passed verbally within engineering units, from one ranked member to the next, in a deliberate chain designed to prevent any single captured soldier from carrying complete tactical knowledge to an enemy. The Legion supplemented its wooden rafts with captured pre-war inflatable boats, stripped from abandoned recreational facilities along the river's western banks. These crossings were practiced, they were rehearsed. By the time the Legion needed to cross the Colorado under pressure, it had already done so many times in silence. What moved ahead of those crossings, well before rafts were ever assembled, were soldiers that no one recognized as soldiers. The Frumentari, the Legion's intelligence and infiltration network, operated entirely outside the standard Legion uniform. They dressed in civilian clothing. They carried forged NCR documentation, convincing enough to pass inspection at checkpoints and outposts scattered along the Mojave's primary roads. They were permitted, under Caesar's direct authority, to lie, to steal, and to use whatever personal means necessary to gather intelligence and position the Legion's advantage before any open military movement began. Among all the Frumentari operating in the Mojave, one name surfaces most clearly in the records. Vulpes Inculta, the network's commanding officer in that region, whose methods defined how the Legion's unseen presence was felt long before its armies arrived. What Vulpes arranged at a small settlement called Nipton was not a battle, it was a message. Nipton had been a town of modest size, inhabited by a mixed population that included civilians, NCR soldiers who had abandoned their posts, and individuals connected to local criminal operations. Volpes and his unit arrived without warning and sorted the population through a lottery system. One person was permitted to walk away unharmed, chosen to carry the story outward. A small number were taken as slaves. The remainder were killed, and their bodies were displayed along the road leading into town, crucified on wooden frames, erected specifically for that purpose, positioned where any approaching traveler would encounter them before any other sign of what had occurred. The single survivor was encountered by the courier still standing in the road, too shaken to move quickly. Vulpes presented the scene not as an act of war, but as a demonstration of what the Legion was willing to do in territory it considered already decided. The demoralization of the NCR was the objective. Every other outcome was secondary. Crucifixion was not invented by the Legion. It was inherited. The punishment, along with decimation, the practice of selecting one soldier from a failed unit by lot and having his comrades execute him, and formalized arena combat as a judicial sentence, was adapted directly from documented Roman military and legal practice. These methods were not approximated loosely or applied casually. They were researched and implemented with the same deliberate precision that governed every other element of the Legion's structure. The result was a disciplinary system that produced a specific kind of obedience, not loyalty in any warm sense, but the steady, grinding compliance of men who understood precisely what failure meant and had watched it applied to others. Those who were captured, rather than killed, sometimes found themselves at Fortification Hill, Caesar's base of operations along the eastern bank of the Colorado. Beneath the hill's main camp sat an arena, known within the Legion as the Pit. It served two functions simultaneously. For the soldiers who gathered to watch, it was entertainment, one of the very few organized recreations permitted within Legion camps. For the prisoners sent into it, it was a sentence without fixed length. Prisoners fought each other, or they fought trained Legion warriors assigned to the arena as a secondary duty. A prisoner who won lived, but only until the next time they were placed back in the pit. No one was ever formally released through combat victory. The record of the pit contains no instance of a prisoner earning their way out through performance. Survival inside it was always temporary. The arena's function as a judicial system was built on that permanence. The understanding that the outcome was never truly open, only delayed. The first Battle of Hoover Dam was the closest the Legion came to making all of those preparations pay off at once. The dam, a vast pre-war hydroelectric structure spanning the Colorado River, represented the single greatest concentration of usable power in the American Southwest. The Legion crossed the river in significant force and pushed into NCR-held positions along the dam's eastern approach. For a period measured in hours, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. NCR defensive lines bent under the assault. Internal positions were compromised. The dam very nearly changed hands. What held it was not a prepared defense, but an improvised one. NCR soldiers constructing barriers from whatever materials were available in the moment, combined with a counterattack coordinated by General Lee Oliver, the NCR's commanding officer in the Mojave. Joshua Graham commanded the Legion's assault. When the attack ultimately failed to take the dam, Caesar named Graham as the reason, and the punishment that followed became one of the most documented events in the Legion's internal history. What became less documented, and considerably more difficult to examine directly, was the question of what General Oliver had actually contributed to the NCR's survival that day. Veterans from Camp McCarran, the NCR's primary military base in the Mojave, described the battle in terms that did not align cleanly with the official account Oliver had allowed to form around his name. Several of those veterans indicated that Oliver's personal command decisions had been minimal during the critical hours of the assault, that the defensive measures which held the dam had been organized at lower levels of the NCRC chain of command by officers whose names never appeared prominently in subsequent reports. Oliver received the credit. Oliver retained his command. His continued presence in a position of authority, despite the private assessments of the soldiers who had served under him, was treated by Legion observers as confirmation of what Caesar had argued about republics since the beginning: that democratic systems reward the appearance of success over its substance, and that the rot this produces travels upward until it reaches the men making the largest decisions. The dam had held, but neither side left the Colorado River unchanged. The battle had written itself into the ground, into the ranks, into the grudges that would outlast every soldier who survived it. The choice was not really a choice. Submit or be destroyed. That was what the Legion offered. And it was extended to 86 separate tribes across the territories that had once been Arizona, Utah, New Mexico, and Colorado. 86 communities, 86 distinct peoples, each with their own language, their own customs, their own understanding of where they came from and what that origin meant. The Legion processed all of them through the same two-option system. And when the surviving populations were folded into the ranks or assigned to labor, the names of those tribes were not archived or preserved or spoken again in any official capacity. They were simply removed. What had existed before the Legion was treated as a rough draft, material to be discarded once the final version had been printed over it. The scale of that erasure across such a wide stretch of territory was not accidental. It was engineered with the same deliberate logic that governed every other element of how the Legion expanded. Each absorbed tribe had its fighters evaluated for Legion service, and its remaining population sorted into labor roles. The territory the tribe had occupied was absorbed into the Legion's network of controlled land. The name of the tribe was struck from any document the Legion produced, and was not permitted to be spoken within Legion camps. What remained of those 86 peoples was not a memory or a record. It was muscle and labor and territory, stripped of the context that had made it a community rather than a resource. In the wasteland, where most things are lost to time and radiation, the Legion accelerated that loss deliberately and called it order. The first thing taken from a conquered person was their name. Male recruits drawn from absorbed tribes were assigned new Latin names. Marcus, Lucius, Flavius, names pulled from Roman history and distributed without reference to the individual receiving them. The name was not chosen to suit the person. It was chosen to suit the Legion, to signal that the person now belonged to a system older and larger than whatever they had been before. Female captives were renamed according to a different logic. They were given names drawn from Roman virtues. Virtue itself, patience, obedience, constance. The name was not merely a label. It was an instruction. It told its bearer what she was expected to become and reminded everyone around her what the Legion valued in the people it held. No Legion member, regardless of rank or length of service, was permitted to use their birth name after induction. The original name was considered dead, not lost, not set aside, but actively deceased, treated with the same finality the Legion applied to everything it had decided to leave behind. That relationship with the dead was itself carefully constructed. The Legion maintained no formal burial rites for ordinary soldiers. A legionary who fell in battle or died in camp was burned where he had fallen, with no ceremony and no marker. The ashes were not collected. The location was not recorded. There was no grave to return to, no stone to carry a name, no designated place where the living could address the dead directly. Only those who had reached the rank of centurion or above were permitted marked graves at Fortification Hill, and even those markers were functional rather than personal, a record of military rank and service, not a testament to a specific individual. Several scholars operating in the Mojave noted, in documents preserved in the ruins of settlements along the major trade roads, that this absence of burial practice was not simply an oversight born of military practicality. It was a deliberate severing of the connection between Legion soldiers and the tribal traditions of ancestor veneration that most of them had grown up with. Tribes across the American Southwest had maintained deep relationships with their dead, rituals, specific burial grounds. The understanding that the ancestors remained present and available to the living through specific acts of remembrance. The Legion removed all of that. A soldier who could not tend his ancestors had fewer reasons to think of himself as belonging to anything that predated the Legion's claim on him. Among all the tribes whose ancestors the Legion had made unreachable, one story surfaces with particular clarity: the story of the Twisted Hares, a powerful and well-organized group from what had once been Arizona. The Twisted Hares had not been conquered in the conventional sense. They had allied the Legion during Caesar's early campaigns, providing intelligence, logistical support, and fighters at a point when the Legion was still consolidating its hold over the surrounding region. The alliance was productive. It continued for long enough that the Twisted Hares had reasonable grounds to believe it was permanent, that their cooperation had earned them a sustained place beside the Legion, rather than beneath it. When the Legion no longer needed what the Twisted Hares could offer, Caesar dissolved the alliance and enslaved the tribe. The transition was not violent in the dramatic sense. It was administrative. The Twisted Hares were reclassified. Their status changed from ally to property, and the machinery of the Legion processed that change without particular acknowledgement of what it represented. The story of the Twisted Hares is carried into the events of the Mojave campaign by a single man named Ulysses, a former member of the tribe whose entire trajectory through the wasteland was shaped by the moment his people were erased. Ulysses traveled through the Mojave and beyond carrying an American flag, not folded or concealed, carried visibly, worn as part of his identity, present in every place he moved through. The flag was not carried as a statement of patriotism toward the nation that had flown it before the bombs. It was carried as a grave marker. The Twisted Hares had adopted the American flag as their own symbol during the years before Caesar reached them, claimed it from the ruins of the old world, and made it theirs, stripped of its original political meaning, and filled instead with the specific identity of their community. When Caesar destroyed that community, the flag became the only remaining object that pointed toward what had existed. Ulysses carried it because the tribe had no graves, no marked territory, no official record in any document the Legion produced. The flag was the only acknowledgement that they had been real. For him, it held more weight than any monument, a symbol repurposed twice, first by the Twisted Hares from the ruins of old America, then by Ulysses from the ruins of the tribe itself. The bull emblem on the Legion's own banners, armor, and coins carried a different kind of borrowed meaning, one that most people moving through the Mojave would never have been positioned to recognize. The symbol was adapted from the standard of a historical Roman military unit known as the Legio Ex Equestris, the 10th Equestrian Legion, which had served under Julius Caesar during the campaigns documented in De Bello Gallico. Caesar selected this emblem not because it held any particular emotional resonance for him personally, but because it was historically accurate. Because anyone with enough knowledge of Roman military history would recognize its origin without being told and would understand immediately the continuity the Legion was claiming for itself. The connection was never stated openly in any Legion document or in any conversation Caesar permitted to be recorded. It was left as an unmarked reference, available only to those who already knew enough to find it. A quiet test of whether the people around him had done the reading. Not every group the Legion encountered in the Mojave was processed as a military conquest. The Great Khans, a raider gang operating in the region north and west of New Vegas, occupied a more ambiguous position in the Legion's strategic calculations. Caesar did not regard the Khans as potential legionaries. Their discipline was considered insufficient, their culture too deeply saturated with chemical dependency and internal disorder to be reformed into functional soldiers. What they offered instead was chemical production, specifically the manufacture and distribution of drugs that moved through the Mojave's various populations. Caesar considered this a supply line worth maintaining at arm's length, and the Legion's approach to the Khans reflected that assessment. They were kept available without being absorbed. The contempt the Legion held for the Khans was documented in a number of dialogue exchanges that were prepared for Mojave area Legion soldiers but removed before the final version of the records was assembled. Those removed exchanges described the Khans in terms that made the Legion's hierarchy of human value explicit. Raiders who dealt in substances were considered below even the tribes that had been enslaved, because at least the enslaved had produced something the Legion could use with pride. Those removed exchanges were not the only material that was prepared and then set aside. Several named tribes had been documented in the early records of the Mojave campaign, given names, assigned territories, provided with dialogue and camp locations, and then quietly withdrawn from the official account before it was finalized. The ridges of northern Nevada appear in these incomplete records, as do the Ironblood clan of southern Utah. Both groups had been positioned as minor regional forces with their own relationships to the Legion's expansion. Not powerful enough to resist, but present enough to complicate the Legion's movement through their territories. Their camp locations were established in the geographic record. Their dialogue was drafted. Their internal hierarchies were sketched in enough detail to suggest that someone had spent real time thinking about who they were. Then they were removed, and the territories they had been assigned fell silent in the official documentation. What remains of them exists only in the underlying structure of the records, not visible in ordinary circumstances, but recoverable by those who know where and how to look. Some of the people who have spent time reconstructing the Mojave's lost history have managed to partially restore them, giving the ridges and the Ironblood a fragmented kind of presence that the original account had chosen to deny them. Every tribe the Legion erased left something behind. A word preserved in a dialect that survived in the mouth of a single slave. A repeating pattern on a piece of salvaged cloth that no one still alive could explain. A name spoken quietly in a corner of a camp where no decanus was standing within earshot. Because no erasure, however thorough and however deliberately maintained, is ever truly complete. Within the Legion's camps, there was a category of person who held no rank, carried no weapon, and was not permitted to move between one section of the camp and another without a designated escort walking beside them. These were not prisoners awaiting trial. They were not enemy combatants under temporary detention. They were women, captured, assigned, and held within a system that had decided their value before they arrived, and had no mechanism for revising that assessment afterward. The walls around them were not always made of wood or stone. Most of them were made of policy, enforced by the same disciplined hierarchy that governed everything else the Legion controlled. Caesar's stated position on the role of women within the Legion was not hidden or euphemized. It was delivered plainly, in direct conversation, to anyone who pressed him on the subject. Women were prohibited from carrying weapons. They were excluded from participation in the rare internal councils, where Legion leadership discussed strategic decisions. They were not permitted to leave camp boundaries without an assigned escort, regardless of the purpose or the distance involved. Caesar's justification for these restrictions was framed not as punishment, but as prioritization. He argued that the roles women occupied within the Legion, bearing children, raising the next generation of soldiers, transmitting approved knowledge to the young, were more essential to the Legion's long-term survival than any combat function. A soldier could be replaced by training another soldier. The system that produced soldiers in the first place required something the Legion considered irreplaceable, and therefore chose to keep under close control. The argument was structured to sound like respect. What it described was a population managed entirely for its reproductive and domestic output, stripped of any autonomy that might redirect that output elsewhere. The system that managed that output operated through a set of arrangements that were never formally codified in any written Legion law, but were consistently applied across camps from Arizona to the Mojave. Captured women who were considered suitable were paired with Legion soldiers who had distinguished themselves in battle or service, not through any process of consent on the woman's part, but as a reward distributed by camp commanders in recognition of military performance. The soldier received a companion. The woman received a slightly improved material situation, better shelter, marginally more food, within a framework that had already decided everything else about her circumstances. Children born from these arrangements were not raised within individual family units. They were folded into communal child-rearing structures, managed by older women, already established within the camp. At approximately age 6, each child was evaluated. The evaluation was not academic or emotional, it was functional. Boys who showed physical development and responsiveness to basic instruction were marked for military induction. Girls were assigned to domestic and instructional roles. The path was set before the child was old enough to understand that a path had been chosen for them, and the terminal entries recovered from Legion camp administration areas reflect that process in the flat, procedural language of inventory management rather than human development. The boys who were marked for military service did not always come from within the camps. Many were taken directly from conquered tribes at the moment of absorption, separated from surviving family members, and inducted into the Legion's training structure at ages as young as 10. These children entered the Legion as recruit legionaries, the lowest formal rank in the hierarchy, and were processed through the same conditioning that shaped older recruits, adjusted only in pace and physical intensity to account for their age. By the time they reached full military age, many of them had spent more years inside the Legion than outside it. The memories that anchor a person to an identity that predates their current circumstances, the language of a parent, the layout of a home, the name they were called before, had grown thin or disappeared entirely. A physician named Arcade Gannon, who travelled through the Mojave and spent considerable time observing Legion-held territory and its former inhabitants, noted in his assessments that this absence of prior memory was not a side effect of the Legion's recruitment practices, but a feature of them. Soldiers who could not remember anything before the Legion had no internal reference point from which defection could be imagined. They could not conceive of returning to something they no longer carried any image of. The Legion had replaced their past so thoroughly that leaving it would have meant stepping into a void rather than a home. For the women who did manage to leave, the method was rarely dramatic. 3 separate women encountered across different locations in the Mojave had each escaped Legion slavery, and each of their accounts, when explored fully through extended conversation, described an escape built around the same core strategy. During a Legion raid on an NCR supply convoy, the chaos of the assault created a window of reduced oversight in the camp. Each woman had obtained salvaged NCR gear in advance. Uniform components, identification markings, equipment consistent with NCR military personnel, and used that window to move out of the camp's boundary zone dressed as an NCR soldier rather than as a Legion slave. The method worked because Legion soldiers attacking an NCR convoy were focused entirely outward, and because NCR gear created the appearance of an established identity that Legion camp guards were not positioned to verify quickly. Whether the similarity across all 3 accounts reflected a known and shared method passed quietly between enslaved women in Legion camps, or whether it was an independent convergence that happened to produce the same solution, was never confirmed by anyone with direct knowledge of how those accounts were assembled. The question sits in the record unanswered, and the silence around it carries its own kind of weight. One of the clearest traces of what a life rebuilt from nothing after Legion captivity could look like was preserved in the records of Camp Forlorn Hope, an NCR military installation positioned in a deteriorating stretch of territory along the Mojave's eastern edge. Among the rangers stationed, There was a woman identified in official NCR records as Ranger Stella. Her service file was consistent with standard NCR Ranger documentation on its surface: rank, assignment, field performance evaluations. Her personal terminal entries, accessible within her assigned quarters, told a more complicated story. The syntax of those entries was different from every other ranger's personal writing found throughout the camp. The sentences were shorter, contractions were absent, phrasing that most native English speakers would produce automatically. The kind of casual compression that becomes invisible when a language has been spoken since childhood was missing throughout. The entries read instead like writing produced by someone who had learned English as a functional second language, acquiring it through deliberate study rather than immersion from birth. The implication carried through the full set of records was that Ranger Stella's NCR identity had been constructed after her escape, rather than inherited from a life lived within NCR territory. Every element of it, the name, the rank, the documented service history, had been assembled piece by piece by someone who understood the system well enough to build a version of herself that fit inside it. What had existed before that construction was not recorded anywhere in the camp. The language Stella had likely grown up hearing before her escape was not primarily English. Latin threaded through every level of Legion life, not as a practical communication tool, since the majority of Legion soldiers were kept illiterate and most spoken orders were delivered in simple English, but as a ritual layer that reinforced the Legion's identity as something older and more absolute than any wasteland faction built from pre-war remnants. Specific Latin phrases appeared in the terminal entries maintained by Legion administration, carved into structural elements of permanent Legion installations, and embedded in the ceremonial language used during formal proceedings. Caesar himself, according to the observations of those who spent extended time in his presence, would shift into Latin when his composure was under stress, when anger moved close enough to the surface that the practiced calm of his English persona became harder to maintain. In those moments, Latin functioned as a private register, a layer of the man that the everyday language of the wasteland had not been built to reach. The phrases were never translated in any official Legion document. They were left in their original form, available in their full meaning, only to those who sought that meaning independently. That gap between the words and their translation was itself a kind of control, a reminder, repeated constantly in carved stone and typed characters, that the Legion contained depths its ordinary members were not equipped to access. Within that controlled system, small adjustments in daily circumstance were available to enslaved women who made themselves useful in specific ways. A woman who could teach, who could sit with younger slaves and guide them through the Latin phrases required in ceremonial contexts, or through the limited literacy that Caesar's approved texts permitted at the lower levels of the camp hierarchy, or through basic medical care practices that kept the camp's labor population functional, could earn incremental improvements in her situation. Better food, distributed through the camp's rationing system, arrived in slightly larger portions. Labor assignments shifted toward tasks that were physically lighter or less exposed to weather. These adjustments were not formally guaranteed by any written policy. They operated through the discretionary authority of camp administrators, who understood that a slave who taught effectively was more valuable than one who did not, and who adjusted conditions accordingly to preserve that value. The system was described in a brief instructional note, prepared for Legion camp administrators, that was removed from the final compiled records before distribution. It exists now only in the earlier, uncirculated version of those documents. A trace of a policy that was practiced but never officially acknowledged, because acknowledging it would have required the Legion to admit that the women it held were capable of things the official framework had not assigned them. The medical knowledge those women sometimes transmitted was not separate from the Legion's own formal medical structure. It existed alongside it, in the gaps it left. The physicians of the Legion, the designated medical staff operating within Legion camps, occupied an unusual position in the hierarchy. They were never assigned to frontline positions. They did not march with assault units or accompany river crossings. They remained in camp, protected by explicit policy from the attrition that consumed ordinary soldiers. Because the Legion understood that a skilled physician represented an investment of time and knowledge that could not be quickly replaced. The respect that Legion soldiers extended toward their camp physicians exceeded what rank alone would have generated. In conversations recorded around Legion camps throughout the Mojave, soldiers who would not hesitate to speak dismissively about their decani, the immediate commanders responsible for their daily discipline, described their physicians in different terms entirely. A good decanus could be replaced by promoting the next capable soldier in the unit. A good physician required years of accumulated knowledge that the Legion's general prohibition on literacy made difficult to develop and nearly impossible to transfer at scale. The scarcity of that knowledge and the suffering its absence would have immediately produced gave Legion physicians a quiet authority that moved independently of the military rank structure around them. The Legion had built a world of strict hierarchies and hard silences, but within those silences, small acts of learning and care had taken root in the spaces Caesar's laws could not entirely reach. Tended carefully, passed between people who had been told they held nothing worth passing on, and surviving precisely because no official record had thought to account for them. From the eastern bank of the Colorado River, Fortification Hill rises against the desert sky in a shape that does not entirely belong to the Legion. The steel framework visible above the camp's outermost tents is not a watchtower or a signal structure. It curves at angles that no military architect would have chosen. It bends and loops back on itself in the particular geometry of something built for motion rather than defense, built for the sensation of speed and height, and the brief, weightless moment at the top of an arc before the descent begins. It is the skeleton of a roller coaster, and it has stood above Caesar's command center since before the Legion existed, a remnant of the place this hill used to be. Before the bombs fell, Fortification Hill was not a stronghold. It was a destination. The pre-war facility built across its slopes was called Fortification Hill Frontier Town, an amusement park constructed in the style of an idealized American West, full of painted wooden facades, costumed performers, and the kind of engineered leisure that the pre-war world had developed into a significant industry. Families came here. Children ran between attractions. The roller coaster carried people skyward and brought them back down, and the whole purpose of the place was the deliberate suspension of ordinary concern. The manufactured experience of being somewhere that held no weight, no obligation, no consequence. Caesar chose this site for his base of operations, with full awareness of what it had been. The contrast between what Frontier Town had represented and what the fort had become was not incidental. It was the point. A civilization built on pleasure and distraction had been replaced by one built on discipline and endurance, and the roller coaster frame standing above the tents was left visible as a permanent, silent illustration of that replacement. Caesar did not remove it. He camped beneath it and let it speak for itself. What the hill said beneath its surface, however, was something Caesar had never fully heard. Beneath Fortification Hill, sealed behind reinforced pre-war construction, and buried under layers of compacted earth and rock, sat a bunker of considerable scale. A facility built to house a large number of prototype Securitron units. The spherical, screen-faced robotic soldiers developed by Robert House before the war as the foundation of his long-term security force. The bunker was not a vault in the residential sense, but its construction was comparable in scale to the smaller Vault-Tec installations that had been built across the region. The Securitrons inside it were sealed in storage, powered down, waiting in a state of preservation that the bunker's automated systems had maintained across the decades since the bombs fell. Caesar had no knowledge of this. The hill he had chosen as the symbolic and operational heart of the Legion's Mojave campaign was sitting on top of an arsenal that belonged to his most powerful rival in the region, and he had been conducting his campaigns from directly above it without ever knowing it was there. The gap in Caesar's knowledge was not simply an oversight born of limited information. It had a specific explanation rooted in Caesar's own directives. Several members of the Frumentari, the Legion's intelligence network, whose function was precisely to uncover things that others wished to keep hidden, had developed suspicions about the ground beneath Fortification Hill during the Legion's early occupation of the site. Vibration patterns inconsistent with solid earth, drainage behavior that suggested hollow spaces below the upper soil layers, small structural irregularities near the hill's base that did not match the surrounding geology. These observations were documented and brought up the chain of command. Caesar received them and responded by ordering that no further investigation be conducted. His reasoning was consistent with a broader principle he applied across the Legion's operations. Technology that could not be understood, mastered, and controlled by the Legion on its own terms was technology that should not be approached. The Frumentari were not equipped to assess whatever lay beneath the hill. Sending them to excavate it would mean confronting something that might resist Legion control entirely. And Caesar preferred a known boundary to an unknown risk. The bunker remained sealed. The Securitrons waited. The Legion camped above them and called the hill its own. That same suspicion of uncontrollable technology shaped the Legion's official position on advanced equipment throughout its operations. The prohibition was not total. It was selective in ways that revealed its actual logic. Energy weapons were forbidden for rank-and-file soldiers, framed as a rejection of pre-war technological dependency. Robots of any kind were prohibited within Legion territory on grounds of ideological incompatibility with the Legion's vision of human-centered civilization. Computers and electronic data systems were excluded from Legion administration, replaced by written records and verbal chains of communication. These prohibitions were presented as principled rejections of the old world's values. But medical equipment was permitted. Communication radios were not only permitted, but actively maintained and deployed across the Legion's entire territorial network. Explosive devices, grenades, mines, demolition charges salvaged from pre-war military stockpiles were used without restriction. The line between forbidden and acceptable technology did not follow a consistent philosophical principle. It followed Caesar's personal judgment about which technologies increased Legion effectiveness, without creating dependencies that could compromise Legion control. The ideology was the justification. The calculation was the actual basis for every decision. The radios that connected Legion camps across the Mojave were pre-war shortwave units, hand-crank models that required no external power source and could be operated by a single soldier without technical training beyond basic instruction. Legion engineers maintained these units, cleaning and calibrating them according to procedures passed down through the engineering ranks in the verbal transmission chains that kept technical knowledge within trusted hands. The units broadcast on frequencies that could be detected by sensitive receiving equipment moving through the region, including the Pip-Boy device worn by the courier, a pre-war personal computing and communication unit that monitored a wide range of signal channels automatically. What the Pip-Boy could detect it could not interpret. Legion radio traffic was transmitted in a code of Caesar's own design, a substitution and transposition system built on Latin root words and military terminology that produced transmissions which sounded, to any listener without the corresponding key, like meaningless strings of syllables. The decryption key was distributed only to frumentari commanders and senior centurions. It was never written down in any form that a captured soldier might be carrying. A specific intelligence document, recovered from a concealed frumentari outpost, positioned along one of the Mojave's secondary roads, contained enough structural information to allow the code to be broken, but only by someone who already held that document and knew what they were looking for. The radio network was not hidden. Its content was. Inside Caesar's personal quarters at the fort, a different kind of hidden content was preserved behind a boundary that was quieter but equally deliberate. The tent that served as Caesar's command space contained a series of personal objects. Books arranged on shelves along one interior wall, a pre-war globe mounted on a wooden stand, handwritten pages covered in dense Latin script that could be examined closely but could not be removed. This restriction was not the result of any in-world policy that Caesar had established. It was a boundary built into the structure of the space itself, ensuring that the courier, regardless of their relationship with Caesar or their standing within the legion, could look at these objects but could not take them. The books could be read at close range. The globe could be studied. The handwritten notes could be observed but not pocketed. The effect of this immovable boundary was subtle but consistent. It established Caesar's personal space as a category apart from the rest of the wasteland's material culture, where almost everything could be picked up, repurposed, or sold. Caesar's objects stayed where Caesar had put them. That distinction was felt even by those who could not have explained precisely why. The books on those shelves told a specific story about the man who had chosen them. Works on Roman military history occupied the most accessible positions. Titles that documented the campaigns, administrative structures, and political philosophy of the Roman Republic and early empire. Among them sat a damaged copy of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, the 18th century work by Edward Gibbon, that traced the long deterioration of the civilization Caesar had chosen as his template. The binding was worn. Pages near the middle had been read more frequently than those at the beginning or end, suggesting sustained engagement with specific sections rather than linear reading. On the lower shelf, positioned beside several smaller volumes, was a pre-war sociology textbook, the kind produced for university courses in the decades before the war, covering theories of social organization, group behavior, and hierarchical systems. A bookmark had been placed in this volume, not at random. It rested near a chapter whose visible heading addressed social stratification and the mechanisms through which populations are divided, ranked, and maintained within fixed categories. The bookmark had been placed there by someone making a point, not to the courier, who might or might not notice it, but as a record of where Caesar's thinking actually lived when no one was performing for an audience. That thinking was served in its daily operations by a population of over 200 enslaved people who maintained every physical function of the fort that did not require a weapon. They erected and repaired tents. They prepared and distributed food. They carried materials between sections of the camp and performed the continuous maintenance that kept a permanent military installation functional across months and years of sustained occupation. The fort held more enslaved people than any other single legion position in the Mojave, a concentration made necessary by the scale of the base's operations and its role as the administrative center of the legion's entire regional presence. These individuals moved through the camp under the eyes of legion soldiers at all times, performing their assigned tasks with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from long familiarity with a routine that offers no alternative. Observers who spent time watching the movements of enslaved workers at the fort noted a particular quality in their idle moments. The brief pauses between one task and the next when no immediate instruction was being given. In those pauses, small physical movements occurred that were distinct from the purposeful motion of labor. A hand extended slightly toward an open space between tents, then withdrew. A body oriented itself briefly in the direction of the camp's outer boundary, then reoriented back toward the interior. These movements were not deliberate or planned. They were the kind of thing the body does when the mind is occupied elsewhere. Automatic, unconscious, carrying the memory of an impulse that had been present long enough to become reflex, even though it was never acted upon. They were the movements of people whose bodies remembered wanting to leave, even after the part of the mind that made plans had stopped asking. The fort had been built on top of a place where people once came to laugh and forget. And in a different kind of forgetting, it had become something else entirely. He came to the Legion's attention by killing its soldiers, not one or two, enough that the battle had to be stopped. The Heidebark's tribe was in the process of being absorbed into the Legion's expanding territorial network, and the absorption was proceeding as it always did, systematically, with overwhelming force applied against a population that had not been given adequate time to organize a defense. Most of the Heidebarks had already been subdued, or were in the process of surrender when a single fighter continued. He did not retreat. He did not negotiate. He moved through the Legion's advancing line and kept moving, and the soldiers around him fell in sufficient numbers that the operation reached a point where the officer commanding the assault sent word back to Caesar that something unusual was happening and that a decision was needed about how to proceed. Caesar made a decision. He halted the conquest. The halt was not a withdrawal and not a ceasefire. It was a pause, a deliberate interruption of an operation that the Legion had the resources to complete by force, without significant strategic cost, issued for the specific purpose of allowing Caesar to consider what he was looking at. The fighter who had stopped the Legion's advance was not valuable as a prisoner. He was not valuable as a slave. He was valuable as a soldier. And Caesar recognized that particular kind of value with the same clarity he applied to every other assessment he made. The man was brought before him. An offer was extended. The Heidebark's warrior, who would be given the name Lanius and the title of legate, the highest military command position in the Legion structure, accepted. The battle ended. The Heidebark's tribe was processed through the Legion's standard absorption procedures. Their most capable fighter now commanded the force that had just conquered them. This moment was not unique in the Legion's history, though it was rare enough to be notable. Records maintained by the Frumentari, the intelligence branch responsible for documenting the Legion's internal history alongside its external operations, contain references to 3 separate instances in which Caesar personally halted a conquest to recruit an enemy fighter. Lanius is the only one of these individuals who is named in the surviving records. The other 2 are listed by tribal origin only, identified by where they came from, rather than by any name the Legion had given them, which suggests either that their subsequent careers did not produce the kind of documented record that would have attached a name to the reference, or that their names were deliberately withheld from the version of the record that circulated beyond the Frumentari's internal files. What the 3 cases share is the quality that prompted Caesar's intervention in each of them. A fighter who continued past the point where rational calculation would have suggested stopping, and who demonstrated in that continuation a kind of capability that the Legion's ordinary recruitment process was not designed to capture. Caesar understood that the most dangerous soldiers were not the ones who fought well within a structure, They were the ones who kept fighting when the structure around them had already decided the situation was resolved. The structure that Lanius wore over his face was not a helmet and not a piece of standard Legion equipment. It was a metal mask, fitted closely to the upper portion of his face and extending down across his jaw, welded into its final position rather than attached by straps or clasps that would allow removal. The Legion's own account of how the mask came to be describes burns, injuries received during the Hydebark's battle, severe enough that the underlying tissue required permanent protection, and that the mask, once placed, could not be safely removed without further damage. His face has not been seen by anyone within the Legion since the mask was fitted. It had not been seen by anyone outside it either. The soldiers under his command had served with him across multiple campaigns and years of sustained warfare, and none of them could describe what he looked like beneath the metal. In the absence of that knowledge, a different kind of knowledge had formed. The kind that fills gaps when no verifiable information is available. Among the Legion's rank-and-file soldiers, the belief had taken hold and persisted without correction that Lanius had always had the mask, that he had been born with it, that the metal was not something placed over a face, but was itself the face, and that whatever lay beneath it was something other than what an ordinary man would have there. The Legion did nothing to correct this belief. The belief was useful. The usefulness of false beliefs about Lanius extended well beyond the question of his mask. The Legion maintained, through deliberate channels of rumor and repeated informal assertion, a set of stories about him that contradicted measurable reality at several points. He did not sleep, according to the stories. He stood through the night in his tent or walked the camp perimeter in darkness, never still, never requiring the rest that reduced ordinary soldiers to vulnerability for hours at a time. He did not eat in the way that other men ate. He consumed something, occasionally, but it was not the regular rationed meals that sustained the rest of the camp. He could not be wounded by conventional weapons in any way that would stop him, only slowed, and even that slowing was temporary. These stories circulated freely among Legion soldiers and spread into the populations the Legion encountered across the Mojave, generating a quality of anticipatory dread in NCR personnel who had heard them and had not yet encountered Lanius directly. The actual capacities of the man beneath the mask were significant but finite. He was powerful. He was highly skilled. He was not immune to damage or exempt from the physical requirements of human survival. The gap between the mythology and the measurable truth was large, and it had been designed to be large, because a legate who could be assessed accurately was a problem that could be solved. A legate who existed partly as an idea was a problem that grew larger every time someone tried to think about it. What Caesar and Lanius shared was a working arrangement built on mutual assessment rather than genuine alignment. Lanius operated within the Legion's command structure and executed Caesar's strategic directions with a consistency that had made him indispensable across the years of the Mojave campaign. He was present where Caesar needed force applied, and he applied it without the hesitation or ideological questioning that might have complicated a commander more personally invested in the civilization Caesar was attempting to construct. But Lanius was not invested in that civilization. The Roman framework, the ranks, the titles, the deliberate adaptation of ancient imperial structure onto a post-war military force held no particular meaning for him beyond its functional utility as an organizing system for the soldiers he commanded. He had not read De Bello Gallico. He had not studied Gibbon. The architecture of the thing Caesar had built was, to Lanius, a set of arrangements that happened to produce effective military outcomes, not a philosophical statement about the direction of human history. He fought because the Legion offered conquest, and conquest was what he understood as purpose. Those who observed both men closely and recorded those observations, noted the same thing in several independent accounts, that the moment Caesar's presence was removed from the equation, the Roman structure Lanius operated within would have no advocate left at the top of the hierarchy with any reason to maintain it. What would follow would be shaped by Lanius's actual values rather than Caesar's, and Lanius's actual values were those of the Hydabarch's warrior who had kept fighting past the point of reason, not those of the scholar who had stopped the battle to offer him a different future. That future, across the different paths the Mojave campaign could take, looked different depending on which way the contest at Hoover Dam resolved. In the version of events where the Legion's assault succeeded and Caesar's forces took the dam, the period that followed was not the stable imperial civilization Caesar had described in his conversations with those who challenged his vision. The narration of that outcome described a legion under Lanius's command that moved into its conquered territory with a momentum that had nowhere left to go and nothing to redirect it. Campaigns continued past the point of strategic necessity. Brutality increased in the absence of the ideological framework that had given it shape and limit under Caesar. The population the legion had absorbed found the conditions of that absorption growing steadily worse, rather than settling into the managed stability that Caesar had argued was the legion's ultimate destination. Within a generation, according to the account preserved in the records of that outcome, the legion had begun to consume the resources of its own territory faster than those resources could be replenished, and the discipline that had made the legion functional was dissolving from the top down, as the organizing principle that had generated it was no longer present to sustain it. The dissolution of that discipline was the thing that most concerned the scholars and observers who had spent time analyzing the legion from outside its structure. A physician named Arcade Gannon, who had personal and professional reasons to study the legion carefully, identified the core problem in direct terms during extended conversations in the Mojave. The legion existed to build something stable, but everything about how it was built depended on continuous war. The expansion was not a phase the legion was passing through on the way to a settled civilization. It was the condition that made the legion function at all. Soldiers who had been shaped entirely by combat, who held their positions within the hierarchy through demonstrated military performance, who had been stripped of every pre-legion identity that might have provided an alternative source of meaning. These soldiers did not have a peacetime mode to transition into. The researchers at Big Mountain, the pre-war think tank operating in isolation in the territory north of the Mojave, reached similar conclusions through a different analytical approach, examining the legion as a social system rather than a military force, and finding the same structural weakness at its center. A machine built entirely for one purpose becomes purposeless the moment that purpose is removed. The legion was a very effective machine, and the question of what it would be when it ran out of frontier had never been answered by anyone, including Caesar, who had studied enough history to know the question existed, and had apparently decided that reaching the frontier was a problem he would address when it arrived. The mechanism through which the legion prevented that question from surfacing too early in its soldiers was the maintenance of absolute discipline through a system old enough to predate the pre-war nation whose ruins it camped among. Decimation, the practice of selecting one member of a failed or cowardly military unit by lot and requiring that unit's surviving members to beat him to death, was implemented in the legion as a direct adaptation of Roman military law. The system was not applied constantly or casually. It was reserved for specific categories of failure. Units that broke and ran from an engagement. Units that failed to execute a direct order. Units that were found to have withheld information about losses or conditions from their commanders. When it was applied, It was applied publicly and completely, witnessed by the camp's assembled soldiers, and recorded in the unit's administrative file. The record noted the date, the unit designation, and the infraction that had triggered the procedure. The name of the soldier who had been selected was included. The names of those who had carried out the sentence were not. Two separate administrative records, recovered from Legion campsites in the Mojave, confirmed the system's use in those locations, describing the process in the same flat procedural language found in other Legion administrative documents. As a standard operational procedure, unremarkable in its categorization, noted and filed alongside supply inventories and patrol schedules. It had never been witnessed directly by any outsider who recorded what they saw. It existed in the record only as description, the account of something known to happen, documented in the language of routine, and never accompanied by the kind of first-hand testimony that would have made it fully present rather than merely confirmed. Lanius was the Legion's sharpest instrument, but instruments do not choose their purposes, and the question of what the Legion would do when it had no more worlds to cut through had never been answered in any language Caesar had studied. The name came first, and the name was old, long before Caesar's Legion raised its bull standard along the Colorado River, long before Edward Sallow opened his damaged copy of De Bello Gallico and began constructing a civilization from its incomplete pages. The word frumentari had existed in the records of an empire that had already risen and collapsed and been forgotten and rediscovered several times over. In the Roman Empire, the frumentari had begun as a mundane administrative function. Soldiers assigned to collect grain from the provinces and ensure its transport to the armies and cities that depended on central supply. They moved through civilian populations as a matter of routine. They observed, they counted, they reported back on what they had seen, because the counting of grain required the counting of everything else that determined how much grain an area could produce. Over time, under the administration of Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century, that observational function was formalized into something more deliberate. The frumentari became an intelligence network, an organization whose members operated within civilian spaces, maintained non-military appearances, and gathered information that the empire's military command could not obtain through open means. Caesar read this history and did not adapt it. He reproduced it. The frumentari of the Legion were the Roman frumentari given new territory and new targets, operating on the same principles that had been documented nearly 2,000 years before the wasteland existed. The grain connection was not merely historical. Food within the Legion structure was a controlled substance in the most literal sense, not distributed freely, not carried by individual soldiers as personal supply, but managed centrally and released through a rationing system that reflected the hierarchy with the precision of a rank insignia. Each Legion camp maintained a central preparation facility where all food was cooked and portioned before distribution. The soldiers who received those portions received different things depending on their position in the command structure. Centurions and the senior ranks above them received meat, protein-dense, calorically sufficient, a material reflection of their status in the organization. Legionaries and recruits received grain and dried fruits, stripped from raided settlements and processed through the camp's stores. The distribution was not secret. It was performed in the open, at scheduled intervals, as a visible daily reminder that position within the Legion determined what a person consumed as surely as it determined what a person was permitted to do, or say, or know. Camp cooks, the soldiers assigned to preparation and distribution, were among the most informed observers of camp social dynamics, because the rationing line was one of the few moments when the entire hierarchy was physically visible in sequence, each person receiving what their rank entitled them to. and moving on. 3 separate cooks encountered across Legion-held territory in the Mojave described this system in similar terms when asked about it, each emphasizing the same element. The distribution was never questioned, and the absence of questioning was itself considered a sign that the camp was functioning correctly. What the Frumentari did before a raid on any settlement was, in structure, not unlike what the original Roman Frumentari had done before a tax collection. They arrived first, they counted, and they left without being identified as anything other than ordinary travelers passing through. The preparation for a legion assault was not the sudden movement of forces toward a target. It began weeks earlier, with one or more Frumentari operatives moving into the area surrounding the target settlement in civilian clothing, carrying documentation that established a false identity consistent with the region's normal population. Over the days and weeks that followed, those operatives catalogued the settlement's population with as much precision as observation permitted. How many residents? How many of those residents carried weapons? Where the weapons were stored, where the water supply was located, where food was kept, which entry points were monitored and which were not. The information was transmitted back through the Legion's communication network and used to design an assault that minimized Legion casualties and maximized the speed and completeness of the operation. The preparation for the assault on Nipton, the settlement where Vulpes Inculta arranged the lottery that left most of its population crucified along the approach road, was not spontaneous. The records and dialogue accounts that touch on that event suggest that Vulpes had been present in the area for at least 2 weeks before the operation began, moving through the surrounding territory and assembling the detailed knowledge that made the assault's outcome so precise and so controlled. The display that followed was not improvised. It was prepared. Vulpes himself remained one of the more opaque figures in the Legion's documented presence in the Mojave. His name, in the Latin that threaded through the Legion's terminology, it translated to something approximately equivalent to Fox of the Unculted Land, a designation that functioned less as a personal identifier and more as a description of operational character. The fox that moves through wild and uncharted territory, the intelligence operative, who is most effective in the spaces that have not yet been claimed by any organized structure. His manner of speaking, in every recorded exchange, was distinct from any other Legion figure encountered across the region, where most Legion soldiers communicated in direct, declarative statements consistent with a culture that valued efficiency and hierarchy over nuance. Vulpes spoke in constructions that were layered and measured, carrying implications that required consideration rather than just reception. The education suggested by that manner of speaking had no confirmed origin in any surviving record. His background before his position within the Frumentari was not documented in any form accessible to outside observers, and the question of where he had come from and what had shaped him before the Legion found him or made him remained genuinely open. Several independent analyses of his known dialogue reached the same tentative conclusion, that his language patterns were consistent with someone raised in an environment where careful, educated speech was the norm rather than the exception. But no account placed that origin with any certainty, and none claimed more than inference from available evidence. There were dimensions of the Frumentari's operations in the Mojave that were prepared for documentation, but never entered the final record. Several operational assignments for Frumentari personnel were developed in sufficient detail to be ready for execution, including one that would have involved recruiting the courier as a temporary operative to conduct surveillance inside an NCR officers' meeting, gathering intelligence on NCR command decisions for transmission back to Legion leadership. The assignment had been fully written. Its dialogue was complete. Its objectives were defined, and its procedural steps were laid out. It was removed from the final operational record before the version of events that has been most thoroughly documented was assembled. The underlying files that contained this assignment were not destroyed. They remained within the record's structural data, accessible to those who knew the record's architecture, well enough to locate material that had been set aside rather than deleted. Some of the analysts who have spent time reconstructing the Mojave's more fragmentary history have managed to partially restore this assignment to a readable state, allowing it to be examined, even though it was never officially executed. The question of how thoroughly a non-Legion individual could pass as a Legion soldier within Legion-held territory was one that had practical implications for both the courier and the various factions attempting to operate around the Legion's presence. The answer, in the version of events most thoroughly recorded, was, imperfectly and briefly, Legion armor could be worn at sufficient distance or in conditions of limited visibility. It produced an approximation of Legion appearance, convincing enough to delay recognition. It did not hold up to close examination by soldiers who knew their colleagues, and it degraded quickly in any environment where Legion personnel were operating at normal camp density. An earlier version of the operational approach, available to the courier, had allowed for a more sustained and stable disguise. Legion armor worn for extended periods, producing reliable non-recognition across a broader range of Legion-held locations. This approach was adjusted before the final record was assembled because the practical consequences of that level of sustained disguise created problems for the reputation system that governed how the Legion assessed the courier's standing. The adjustment produced a version of disguise that was functional but limited, which more accurately reflected the difficulty of maintaining a false identity within a community whose members knew each other through years of shared service, and whose culture placed significant value on the recognition of rank and face. The reputation the Legion held among the Mojave's various factions and populations was not uniformly hostile, but it was predominantly so. Every major organized group operating in the region maintained a negative baseline assessment of the Legion's presence and intentions, with two exceptions that were each explicable by specific circumstances. The Great Khans, the raider organization whose operations centered on drug production and distribution, began from a neutral position, not favorable, but without the active hostility that characterized most other factions' initial stance. This neutrality reflected the economic relationship that Caesar had identified as potentially useful, keeping the Khans available as a supply source without absorbing them into the Legion's structure. The Powder Gangers, a violent criminal organization that had emerged from a failed prison labor arrangement, shared with the Legion a specific contempt for the New California Republic that produced a passive alignment of interests, despite no formal relationship between the groups. Every other faction in the region, including those that occasionally received material benefit from Legion-adjacent trade activity, maintained a negative passive assessment of the Legion's presence. The assessment was not always expressed as active aggression. It sat beneath the surface of every interaction, shaping the terms on which those interactions occurred, present as a condition even when it was not the subject of any particular exchange. One group in the Mojave held a position in the Legion's assessment that was distinct from all others, not as an enemy, not as a neutral, not as a potential resource, but as something the Legion had concluded was beneath any of those categories. The Fiends, a raider gang concentrated in the areas surrounding the ruins of the pre-war city, were characterized in Legion administrative records through language that was notably direct, even by the standards of Legion documentation. They were described as having been made unfit for the kind of discipline that Legion service required, not by external circumstances or by choices that could theoretically be reversed, but by the effects of sustained chemical dependency, primarily the inhalant known as jet, combined with a pattern of violence that had become detached from any strategic or organizational purpose. The Legion's position on absorption was broad. It had taken in fighters from dozens of tribal backgrounds, had found uses for populations across a wide range of physical and psychological conditions, and had built a system specifically designed to process hostile individuals into functional soldiers. The Fiends represented the one category the system had assessed as beyond that processing, not dangerous enough to require military elimination, but not recoverable enough to justify the investment of Legion resources that absorption would have required. They occupied a space in the Legion's worldview that had no formal name but functioned as a flaw, the lowest point on the scale of what the Legion considered human material worth working with, and the only group in the Mojave explicitly identified as falling beneath it. The Frumentari moved through the Mojave like weather, present in the damage they left, but rarely visible in the moment of their passing. And that invisibility was, in its own way, the most Roman thing Caesar had built. The prohibition existed in words, not locks. No physical mechanism prevented a Legion soldier from picking up a laser rifle or a plasma pistol from the ground where a dead enemy had dropped it. The weapons functioned. They were present in the wasteland in sufficient quantity that any soldier who wanted one could have found one without significant effort. The restriction was maintained entirely through the understanding that carrying such a weapon was against Legion policy, that policy violations were observed and reported within the Legion's disciplined camp culture, and that the consequences of being identified as someone who had placed personal preference above Legion doctrine were not abstract. The prohibition held because the system around it held, and the system held because Caesar had built it to be self-enforcing at every level simultaneously. The official reasoning for the energy weapon prohibition was practical in its framing. Plasma rifles and laser weapons depended on power cells, specific pre-war energy units that were not manufactured anywhere in the post-war American Southwest and could only be obtained through salvage or trade. A Legion unit equipped with energy weapons was a unit whose combat effectiveness was tied to a supply chain it could not control. If the power cells ran out in the field, the weapons became heavy, useless objects that a soldier was now carrying, instead of the conventional blade or firearm that would have remained functional indefinitely. Caesar's argument was that this dependency represented a structural vulnerability inconsistent with the Legion's operational philosophy of living off the land and maintaining function, regardless of external supply conditions. The argument was coherent. It was also selectively applied. Veteran legionaries and centurions were permitted to carry captured energy weapons as personal items, trophies from notable engagements, kept and occasionally displayed as evidence of past performance. These weapons were charged and functional. They were carried by soldiers who were, by definition, operating within the same supply constraints that the prohibition was designed to address. The distinction between a standard issue energy weapon and a trophy energy weapon was maintained entirely through policy language, with no material difference in the object itself. The prohibition was real. Its boundaries were drawn by Caesar, and Caesar drew them where he chose. That pattern, rules that existed as spoken tradition rather than written code, applied through hierarchy rather than documentation, extended across the entirety of Legion governance. There was no written law code in the Legion, no compiled set of regulations that a soldier could consult or that a commander could cite with a physical reference. The rules that governed Legion life were passed verbally, transmitted from decani to the recruits under their authority during the conditioning period that shaped new inductees, and reinforced through the observation of how violations were treated when they occurred. A soldier learned what was forbidden by being told it was forbidden, by watching what happened to those who crossed the line, and by internalizing the behavioral standards of the unit around him, until compliance became reflexive rather than calculated. Caesar served as the final point of adjudication for disputes and violations, that the standard hierarchy could not resolve at a lower level. Matters that could not be settled by a decanus went to a centurion. Matters that could not be settled by a centurion eventually reached Caesar. This system functioned with reasonable efficiency within a population of manageable size. A community where the number of disputes requiring escalation remained small enough that one person could address them without creating a backlog that undermined the authority of the system itself. Scholars and physicians who examined the legion's administrative structure from outside identified the same limiting condition. The system was calibrated for a specific scale, and beyond that scale, the absence of written law would generate more disputes than the verbal tradition could absorb. The legion had not yet reached that scale in the Mojave. The question of what would happen when it did had not been answered. The scale the legion had already reached, across all the territory it held east of the Colorado River, was larger than most Mojave residents understood. NCR intelligence assessments, compiled from field reports, informant accounts, and aerial observation of Legion-controlled regions, produced estimates of the Legion's total population ranging from 80,000 to approximately 120,000 individuals, distributed across the territories that had once been Arizona, Utah, New Mexico, and the eastern portions of Colorado. The Mojave Force, the contingent visible to anyone moving through the desert west of the river, represented only a fraction of that total. The soldiers massed at Fortification Hill and distributed across the camps between Boulder City and Cottonwood Cove were the Legion's forward deployment, the portion of a much larger body that had been directed toward the Hoover Dam campaign. Behind them, in territory that had been consolidated and was being held rather than actively contested, an additional force of considerable size maintained the Legion's control over a geographic area larger than most post-war political entities had ever governed. The presence of that force was felt in the Mojave, primarily through its absence, through the knowledge that what faced the NCR across the river was not the full extent of what Caesar commanded. What Caesar commanded in his consolidated territories operated on principles that his Mojave doctrine officially rejected. The water treatment facilities that had existed as pre-war infrastructure in Arizona had not been destroyed when the Legion absorbed the region. They had been repaired, maintained, and kept in operational condition by Legion engineers working from salvaged technical manuals. A small hydroelectric installation along one of the region's river systems had been assessed, preserved, and integrated into the power supply for several of the Legion's more permanent administrative facilities in the area. At least one pre-war communications relay, a tower-mounted signal amplification system of the kind that had supported civilian radio networks before the war, had been identified, inspected, and placed under Legion engineering management rather than demolished. Arcade Gannon, the physician whose observations of the Legion produced some of the more detailed outside accounts of its internal operations, noted this contradiction in direct terms during conversations in the Mojave. The Legion that presented its rejection of pre-war technology as a foundational principle was simultaneously running water treatment infrastructure that required continuous technical maintenance, drawing power from a dam built before the bombs fell, and broadcasting communications through a relay system that predated the Legion by more than a century. The contradiction was not hidden exactly. It simply existed in a different location than the doctrine was being performed. and the distance between Arizona and the Mojave was sufficient that the two realities did not have to be reconciled in any single conversation. The engineers who maintained that infrastructure occupied an unusual position within the Legion's restrictions on literacy and written knowledge. Every other category of Legion soldier was forbidden from keeping personal written records. The ban was categorical and consistently enforced, part of the broader system of controlled information flow that concentrated knowledge at the top of the hierarchy and maintained dependency at the bottom. Legion engineers were exempt from this ban in one specific and limited way. They were permitted to keep notebooks. The notebooks were not written in plain Latin, which Caesar had determined placed them too close to the literacy he reserved for the frumentari and senior command. Instead, the engineers wrote in a simplified cipher, a substitution system that converted technical terminology and numerical measurements into a notation that was readable by other engineers trained in the same cipher, but illegible to anyone approaching it without that specific preparation. The cipher had been designed by Caesar personally, which meant it was both a practical solution to the literacy problem and a demonstration that Caesar's control extended even into the notation system used by the people maintaining his water supply. The engineers knew it was a cipher he had created. The awareness of that fact was itself part of the system, a reminder built into every page of every notebook that the knowledge they were permitted to hold had been shaped and bounded by the same authority that governed everything else. Within the camps that those engineers maintained and supplied, the emotional content of Legion life sometimes surfaced in places where the administrative record had not anticipated finding it. Terminal entries recovered from several Legion installations across the Mojave contained text in degraded Latin that, when translated, did not match the operational and administrative content that surrounded it. References to people who had existed before the Legion, family members, communities, relationships, appeared in entries that had been filed among supply inventories and patrol schedules. Complaints about camp conditions, expressed in language too specific and too personal to function as official documentation, sat in files alongside maintenance reports. Statements of doubt, phrased carefully but unmistakably, about the direction of the campaign or the reasoning behind specific orders occupied space in records that had been designated for operational information. These entries had been placed deliberately, constructed to reflect the internal reality of soldiers, whose conditioning had suppressed, but not entirely eliminated, the human responses that preceded their Legion identity. The conditioning had been effective enough to keep those responses out of behavior and speech. It had not been effective enough to keep them out of the private act of typing at a terminal in a quiet moment, when no one was present to observe that the soldier operating the machine was putting something into the record that Caesar's system had not asked for and would not have approved. What the terminals preserved in text, the soldiers' bodies preserved in motion. During the intervals between assigned tasks, the pauses that occurred in any working environment when one duty had ended and the next had not yet begun, Legion soldiers in the Mojave exhibited a set of physical behaviors that were consistent across individuals and locations, in ways that suggested they were not random. A hand moved to touch the exterior of a pocket, pressing against whatever was inside without reaching in. The gesture of confirming that something was still present, something kept private and not subject to inspection. Eyes moved toward the horizon in the direction that pointed away from the camp center, held there for a moment, then returned to the camp's interior. Hands came together briefly in a cupped position, the fingers closing around a space that contained nothing visible. The posture of someone holding something small and familiar in a moment of stillness. These movements did not occur during combat. They did not occur when a senior soldier was within direct observational range. They occurred in the spaces between. The gaps in the day that the Legion's schedule of duties and discipline had not entirely filled, when the body reverted to the habits that the conditioning had covered over without removing. An animator who had studied human movement extensively described these specific behaviors as the gestures that people produce when they believe no one is watching, which meant they were also gestures that revealed something about what a person carried internally that their visible conduct was not showing. The Legion had built its power on the rejection of the old world's weaknesses, but the old world's habits had followed its soldiers into every camp, hidden in the space between one order and the next. The desert was not chosen by accident. Caesar understood the Mojave in terms that went beyond its position on a map or its proximity to the dam he intended to take. The harshness of the landscape, the heat that accumulated across exposed ground through the long afternoon, the absence of reliable water across stretches that could kill an unprepared traveler within 2 days, the creatures that moved through the scrub with no particular interest in the hierarchy of any human faction. All of this was understood by Caesar as a mechanism, a filter. The soldiers who marched from Legion-held territory east of the Colorado River and made it through the Mojave to the camps near Hoover Dam had already been tested by something that cared nothing about their rank or their training or their years of Legion service. The desert had assessed them on its own terms and found them sufficient. Those who had not been sufficient were gone before reaching the battle. Caesars described this philosophy directly, in conversation, as one of the organizing principles behind the decision to mount the Hoover Dam campaign through the Mojave rather than through routes that might have been logistically simpler. The landscape was not an obstacle to be managed. It was a collaborator doing selection work that no Legion trainer could have replicated under controlled conditions. The camps those surviving soldiers occupied were not placed by chance or convenience. Every named Legion camp positioned across the Mojave sat with its back against high ground, a rock formation, a ridge line, an elevated terrain feature that prevented approach from behind without the approaching force having to move uphill in full view of the camp's defenders. This placement principle came directly from Roman castramentation doctrine, the system of rules governing how Roman military camps were positioned and constructed during active campaigns. The doctrine specified that camps should use natural terrain features as passive defensive elements wherever possible, reducing the number of soldiers required for perimeter defense and channeling any attacking force toward approaches that could be covered by fewer defenders. Caesar had applied this principle across every camp in the Mojave, without documented exception. The consistency was not immediately obvious at ground level, where each camp appeared to have been placed in response to local conditions. It became visible only when the positions were examined together against a complete map of the region's topography, which revealed the same structural logic repeated across every location. Each camp a small application of a system designed 2,000 years earlier for terrain that looked nothing like the Nevada desert. The routes that Legion patrols followed through that terrain contained gaps that were consistent enough to constitute a pattern. 3 specific areas in the Mojave were systematically avoided by Legion patrol circuits. The territory surrounding Nellis Air Force Base, where the Boomers, a heavily armed and intensely territorial community, maintained a perimeter enforced by functional pre-war artillery. The area around the Repcon Aerospace Research Facility, where the population of feral ghouls and the presence of unstable pre-war rocket fuel created conditions that offered no strategic value, and the outer boundary zones of the region known as the Divide, a stretch of devastated land accessible through the western approach that had been rendered nearly uninhabitable by geological and atmospheric instability. Whether these avoidances reflected deliberate tactical assessment, a Legion command decision that the risk of engaging those areas outweighed any benefit, or whether they reflected the practical limits of how patrol routes had been laid out across difficult terrain, remained unresolved in the surviving records. No official Legion document addressed the exclusions directly, and no outside source confirmed the reasoning behind them. The Divide's exclusion from Legion movement was not simply a matter of difficult terrain. The region had a specific history with the Legion that made its condition partly a Legion problem, rather than a purely natural one. Before the Divide became the shattered, storm-racked landscape it was at the time of the Mojave campaign, it had been a settlement of modest but genuine function. A community positioned along a route that connected Legion-held Eastern Territory to the Mojave's western approaches. Legion couriers had moved through it, carrying packages and correspondence across the route it provided. One of those couriers was a man named Ulysses, whose connection to the Legion was layered with the specific bitterness of the Twisted Hare's betrayal, described in earlier accounts of the Legion's tribal absorptions. The packages moving through the Divide on that route included materials whose contents triggered a catastrophic chain of events in the settlement's infrastructure, events that destroyed the community, rendered the route impassable, and removed from the Legion's operational map a supply corridor that had represented genuine strategic value. The Legion never formally acknowledged this loss in any document that survived the Mojave campaign. Ulysses considered that silence one of the more revealing things the Legion had ever produced, a strategic failure that the organization had decided was easier to erase from the record than to examine. What Legion's soldiers carried through the desert on every other route was deliberately minimal. Each soldier was trained to move with a single canteen, refilling from environmental sources. Springs collected morning moisture, the water stores of settlements along the route, rather than depending on centrally managed supply caches that would require protection and create logistical vulnerability. In the Mojave's specific conditions, this approach worked well for soldiers who had been trained to read the desert's water signals accurately. It created a significant weakness in one circumstance: contaminated water sources. The NCR's Operation Purify, a campaign to introduce chemical agents into Colorado River tributaries and secondary water sources used by Legion patrols, targeted this vulnerability directly. The operation achieved limited results. The Legion's route knowledge allowed many units to avoid the affected sources, and the contamination levels achievable through the NCR's available materials were not consistently lethal. But the attempt itself confirmed that the Legion's water discipline, which was a genuine strength in most conditions, had a defined edge that an informed opponent could try to work against. The creatures that shared the Mojave with Legion patrols presented a different category of risk, one the Legion addressed not by avoidance, but by incorporation into its selection process. Cazadors, the large and highly aggressive flying insects that occupied significant portions of the Mojave's open terrain, were among the most dangerous non-human threats a patrol could encounter. Their venom acted quickly, their attacks came in numbers rather than isolation, and the combination of speed and toxicity made a Cazador encounter genuinely lethal for soldiers who were not prepared to respond effectively. Legion soldiers were not provided with antivenom as standard equipment. The reasoning, expressed by Legion trainers in conversations recorded across multiple camp locations, was that a soldier who could not survive a Cazador encounter had demonstrated a level of situational awareness and physical response that was insufficient for the campaign the Legion was conducting. Survival of the encounter was itself the credential. Those who did not survive it were not mourned as losses to the Legion's capacity, They were understood, within the Legion's framework, as having revealed their own insufficiency before reaching the battle where that insufficiency would have cost the unit more. The medical treatment available to those who did survive but were injured drew from a combination of sources that reflected the Legion's absorbed knowledge across 86 conquered tribes. Captured stimpaks, the pre-war medical devices that accelerated tissue repair through chemical injection, were maintained in Legion medical stores and used in cases where speed of recovery was operationally necessary. Alongside these, Legion physicians applied herbal treatments derived from the traditional medicine of absorbed tribal populations, knowledge collected during conquest, and preserved within the physicians of the Legion as a body of practice passed between practitioners rather than written in any reference document. Wound closure used a suturing technique developed by Legion physicians using pre-war surgical wire, producing results that were functional and durable under field conditions. Anesthesia was administered only in cases where the procedure itself would cause a level of physical shock that threatened the patient's survival rather than their comfort. The absence of pain management in routine surgical treatment was framed within Legion medical culture as an assessment of endurance, an additional data point about the soldier's capacity, rather than as a deliberate imposition of suffering. The framing was consistent with how the Legion categorized most forms of hardship, as information about the person experiencing it, rather than as conditions requiring mitigation. The hardship that former Legion soldiers most consistently identified as the one that had changed them most permanently was not physical. It was the third phase of the standard recruit conditioning process, a period that Legion trainers referred to as the quieting. After the initial phases of physical conditioning and weapons training had been completed, new recruits entered a structured period of enforced silence that lasted between 1 and 3 weeks, depending on the assessment of the supervising trainer. During the quieting, no speaking was permitted. Eye contact with senior soldiers was not allowed. The recruit moved through daily tasks: measles, maintenance duties, physical exercise, without verbal communication, without the social signals that most people use continuously to navigate group environments, without the small exchanges that confirm a person's place within a community. Former Legion members described this phase, in conversations recorded across the Mojave, as the point at which the person they had been before the Legion stopped feeling like someone they were still connected to. The silence had not erased that prior identity in any single dramatic moment. It had simply made it feel very far away. And in the desert, where distance was something the body understood as permanent, far away and gone were not always easy to distinguish. The desert had shaped the Legion as much as Caesar had, baking patience into soldiers who had learned to wait without asking why, and to move without needing to be told where. The structure had been standing for over 200 years before the Legion ever camped within sight of it. Hoover Dam had been built across the Colorado River in the early 1930s, a project of extraordinary scale for its era, requiring thousands of workers, years of continuous labor, and an engineering ambition that treated the river not as a fixed feature of the landscape, but as a problem to be solved. The solution had held. The war that ended the Old World had not touched the dam directly. The 2 centuries of neglect and intermittent habitation that followed had worn its surfaces and corroded its mechanical systems in places. But the fundamental structure, the vast curved wall of concrete pressed against the river's flow, the turbines still capable of converting that flow into electrical current, had endured. By the time the NCR established control over it, and the Legion positioned itself on the eastern bank to contest that control, Hoover Dam was producing approximately 1.2 gigawatts of electrical power, a figure documented in the technical assessments that NCR engineers maintained for the facility. That number meant something specific in the post-war Southwest. It meant New Vegas. It meant the lights on the Strip and the power running through the Lucky 38 yet, and the current that kept Robert House's life support systems operational. It meant every settlement within the dam's distribution range that had rebuilt itself around the assumption of reliable electricity. Caesar understood that a destroyed dam gave no one anything. A captured dam gave the Legion everything. Robert House had understood this before Caesar ever opened his damaged copy of De Bello Gallico. House's pre-war projections, the long-range assessments he had prepared during the final years before the bombs fell, built on demographic and resource modeling that most contemporary analysts had considered excessively pessimistic in its assumptions about civilizational collapse, had identified Hoover Dam as the single most strategically significant post-war resource in the American Southwest, not the most valuable pre-war military installation, not the most significant population center. The dam, the thing that turned moving water into usable power, was the foundation on which any durable post-war civilization in the region would have to be built. And House had positioned himself in Las Vegas specifically, because Las Vegas was within the dam's operational range. Everything he had constructed and preserved and planned across the decades between the war and the events of the Mojave Campaign was contingent on that power continuing to flow. His Securitron army, the spherical robotic soldiers stationed across New Vegas and sealed in the bunker beneath Fortification Hill, required electrical supply to maintain operational readiness. The Lucky 38, the casino tower that served as both his residence and his command center, drew power continuously for the systems that kept him alive. The Strip's infrastructure, the neon, and the climate control and the security networks, all of it traced back to the same source. House had built New Vegas as a structure that the dam held up, and he had done so deliberately because he intended to control the dam and therefore control the structure. The dam's significance extended beyond the factions competing for its ownership in ways that complicated the military calculus for every side involved. The water purification system that the dam powered served settlements distributed across both banks of the Colorado River, communities that existed on what was nominally Legion territory, as well as communities within the NCR's sphere of influence. Tribes that had been absorbed into the Legion structure depended on that purified water supply as surely as NCR settlers did. A decision to destroy the dam, rather than capture it, would have damaged the Legion's own population almost as directly as it damaged the NCR's. Caesar needed the dam to remain intact and operational, not only because its power was valuable, but because the alternative was a strategic own goal that would have undermined the Legion's credibility as a governing force in the territories it already controlled. The campaign was not simply a military contest for a useful installation. It was a demonstration that the Legion could take and hold something complex and functional, producing the kind of tangible benefit to regional populations that Caesar argued republics were too corrupt and too slow to deliver. Destroying the dam would have proven nothing, except that the Legion could break what others had built. The plan developed for the Second Battle of Hoover Dam was designed around the dam's physical layout and the NCR's established defensive positions. 3 separate assault components were prepared to operate in sequence rather than simultaneously. The first was a feint directed at the eastern approach to the dam, a visible force movement designed to draw NCR defensive attention and resources toward a point of contact that was not the primary objective. While NCR commanders were responding to the eastern pressure, the main assault force was directed through the dam's visitor center, the pre-war public facility that occupied a position on the structure's upper level and provided access to the dam's interior. through routes that bypassed the most heavily fortified external defensive lines. A third component, a reserve force positioned upriver from the main crossing, was tasked with flanking the NCR's defensive alignment from the north, completing the encirclement of the dam's defenders. Each of these three components was documented in officer conversations and administrative records preserved from Legion command positions, and each could be influenced by a sufficiently capable and informed individual moving through the battle independently of either side's command structure. The visitor center that served as the main assault's entry point had preserved, within its display cases, a set of materials that predated the Legion, the NCR, and the war itself. Pre-war Hoover Dam visitor guides had been produced for the millions of tourists who had traveled to the dam during its operational years as a public attraction, and the display cases in the facility contained information drawn directly from those guides. The dam's construction start date, its dimensions, the weight of the concrete structure, the engineering principles that made its design effective against the river's pressure. These details had been reproduced in the facility with only minor adjustments to fit the context of the Fallout universe, preserving the actual historical record of the real structure within the fictional one. The construction's start date of 1931 appeared on one display. The dam's total weight of 6.6 million tons appeared on another. A visitor to the facility who read the displays carefully would have encountered, within a post-war ruin, an accurate account of how a pre-war engineering project had been accomplished. The accuracy was not accidental. It was a decision to let the real history of the place persist inside the fictional history laid over it. Deeper within the dam, in a corridor that saw less traffic than the visitor center's public areas, a pre-war plaque had been mounted on the interior wall at some point during the dam's original construction. The plaque listed 96 names. The workers who had died during the building of Hoover Dam, recorded in the order of their deaths, their names pressed into metal that had spent 2 centuries accumulating the slow corrosion of a damp environment. The plaque was still readable. The names were still distinguishable. No character who moved through the dam's interior during the events of the Mojave campaign ever stopped to comment on it, never acknowledged it in dialogue, never made it the subject of any exchange. It existed as a feature of the environment rather than a feature of the narrative, present for anyone who looked at the walls carefully, invisible to those who moved through the space, focused on the living. The workers had died building something they expected to serve the civilization that employed them. The plaque was the only record of their presence in a structure that had long since passed beyond any relationship with the world that had built it. The Legion's own dead at the dam received no comparable acknowledgement. Soldiers who fell during the assault on Hoover Dam were not recorded in any Legion document. Their names, the Latin names the Legion had given them, the tribal names they had carried before the Legion found them, did not appear in any administrative file maintained at Fortification Hill or at any of the forward camps. The Legion's position on the recording of individual casualties was consistent with its broader treatment of individual identity. What the Legion had used, the Legion did not subsequently memorialize. One soldier, a recruit who had survived the first battle and remained in the Mojave in the years that followed, had developed his own response to this institutional silence. He kept a list, not of Legion names, but of the original tribal names of the soldiers he had known who had not survived. The names those soldiers had been given at birth, before the Legion had decided those names were dead. The list was written on a small piece of salvage paper and stored beneath a specific rock near his sleeping area, in a location he had chosen because it was not subject to regular inspection. He described the list to the courier without being asked about it, as though the act of telling someone that it existed was itself a form of preservation. The battle that the dam's history had been building toward produced, in its aftermath, a range of possible states that extended far beyond what any single account of the events could contain. 14 separate conditions had been prepared for the dam's interior following the conclusion of the second battle, each reflecting a different combination of outcomes across the various components of the assault and the various interventions that had shaped its progress. Of those 14, 4 were accessible through the ordinary sequence of events that the campaign produced. The remaining 10 existed in the underlying record of the battle's possible outcomes, conditions that had been fully prepared, that reflected genuine possibilities in the logic of how the dam could have been fought over and resolved, but that the ordinary flow of events could not reach without specific knowledge of the record structure and deliberate effort to access what it contained. The dam had been built to last. The account of what happened to it had been built with a similar thoroughness, prepared for outcomes that most observers would never see, maintained in the record against the possibility that someone would eventually look for them. The dam had been built by men who expected it to last forever, and in the wasteland it had, surviving everything except the question of who it now belonged to.